and I tweeted out live, so some people do filter in as we go on here. So we just tweet it out. And okay, so like I just mentioned off air, so to say, we've been longtime correspondents in various endeavors related to the American Conservative, but this is actually our first time chatting face-to-face in cyberspace. So that's thank you to our overlords at Google for enabling this. I guess just as a matter of quick housekeeping, I saw recently that you are departing from the American Conservative, at least in a day-to-day capacity. Do you want to say anything just briefly about what brought that about? What is your role going forward with the magazine, that kind of thing?
Well, it's a time of transitions, not just in government, but in a great many other institutions as well. So I'm stepping aside from being the editor of the American Conservative and becoming the editor-at-large. And in that capacity, I'll be doing a little bit more writing. I won't be directly involved in assigning stories, so I'm afraid, Michael, you'll have to pitch your stories to someone new. But it'll allow me to take on a number of projects that I've wanted to pursue for a while that have been kind of awkward to take on as an executive of a nonprofit institution like the American Conservative. So I'm now a free agent to the degree that I can talk openly about politics, I can endorse people, I can do other sort of direct things that otherwise would be rather awkward for me to undertake.
So you were inhibited from offering a personal endorsement of a candidate in your role as editor-in-chief of the American Conservative, given its association with a nonprofit entity?
Yeah, that's right. So if you looked at the Scholars and Intellectuals for America, which was the pro-Donald Trump list of scholars and writers, you'll see that there were a number of editors from nonprofit publications on board. Myself, for example, from the American Conservative. You had people from the New Criterion. You had people from First Things, from the Claremont Review of Books. But in most cases, you didn't have the affiliations mentioned on the list. And that's because, if you are the editor of a nonprofit publication, the executive director of a nonprofit foundation that produces a publication, you can't really directly endorse a candidate. And you want to be careful about political engineering and direct political engagement. So I wound up doing a lot of, writing about Trump and about politics for other outlets in the last few weeks of the elections, including, for various British outlets such as the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator.
Yeah, and I read some of your debate recaps, I guess, in the national interest. But the fact that you were barred or prohibited from expressing a direct personal preference about a presidential candidate, that kind of speaks to the fundamental absurdity underlying the, tax system, which regulates how nonprofits must operate. I mean, has that occurred to you? I mean, doesn't that seem just patently absurd that you, as somebody who's involved in political commentary and political writing professionally, were somehow impeded from stating your personal views?
No, I think there are the bright lines that you can't cross. So the nonprofit publication itself, for example, can't endorse a candidate. But then there are these softer considerations of just how much how proper is it for an executive of a nonprofit institution to be openly, or not even openly, but to be involved in one way or another directly with politics. And sometimes it's not a matter of law or regulation, it's just a matter of sort of appropriateness and what's ethical. So I think now that as a free agent, as someone who can work more in the for-profit realm and in other realms indeed, I can do a few things that would have been difficult as a nonprofit executive. And that applies not only to journalists at nonprofit publications, it applies to pastors and churches, for example, to any kind of nonprofit institution, academics as well. Academics, there's a little bit more leeway. There's a little bit more of an understanding, I think, that they can, sort of openly do the things that they do. Universities and colleges have their campus Republicans and campus Democrats. So there's a bit more of a, space there for them to be engaged in politics. But if you're a nonprofit executive, especially at a publication, you have to, on the one hand, follow the clear laws, but you also have to, have a kind of internalized ethic about how engaged you want to be in some of these things. And for the most part, the effort, the objectives of the American Conservative are primarily educational. They're about informing voters. They're about letting them understand where things lie on the issues. It's about looking at philosophy as well as at hard politics. So it really does have a mission that's distinct from the more purely political advocacy kind of journalism that I might undertake, as a freelancer for other outlets.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons I've always appreciated the American Conservative and have been a contributor now for over 5 years, because there's always sort of been a baseline of intellectual integrity, such that it wasn't unforeseeable for somebody of an overtly left-wing bent to write for the American Conservative. So actually, the reason why I ended up writing for the magazine at all is because it was recommended to me by Chase Madar, who ended up, I think, initially facilitating our contact now over like 5.5 years ago. Was that sort of broad tent kind of approach conscious on your part from the outset? Did it just sort of come about organically? Was it just sort of an outgrowth of your personal predilections? What do you kind of source that to?
Well, we want writers who have a clear, strong voice and who are independently minded and will analyze things, sort of fairly and incisively, no matter where they're coming from. So on the one hand, yes, we have, clear conservative political commitments, conservative philosophical commitments, but on so many issues, especially on foreign policy, it's valuable simply to have, fair-minded analysts who will give us their unvarnished opinion, or give us, sort of straight-up reporting from the campaign trail or what have you, without having to have a lot of ideological, pre-positioning baked into it. And, in terms of having a few progressive contributors and a few people who are philosophically from the left, I think that's also intellectually stimulating and keeps conservatives and people from the right on their toes. And I think it also, helps you understand America better. One of the major criticisms I would make of the mainstream media and a lot of progressive outlets is that they basically ignored the whole Trump phenomenon. They ignored the fact that you had articulate Americans, you had ordinary citizens who were supporting Donald Trump. They wanted to pretend that the only conservatives who had opinions or whose opinions could be heeded were, those who were columnists for the Washington Post or the New York Times, who were generally, even though they were, sort of Republicans, they weren't people who viscerally had this attachment to Donald Trump or to the kind of populism that he represented. So it seems to me that by casting a wide net, you actually better inform your readers and you better understand politics yourself.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, as somebody who has never self-identified as a conservative, I found it useful for me intellectually to kind of self-impose an element of restraint on my own rhetorical style, such that it would be amenable to a conservative-leaning audience. So I could convey certain ideas that are still consistent with my, fundamental beliefs, but are still, that a conservative audience would still find receptive. So I think that's a sort of that's a worthwhile almost training exercise for oneself, the ability to communicate to a wide diversity of audiences. And I think that's something that I've always appreciated as an American Conservative contributor, because I obviously would have to, obviously the approach is going to be a little more subtle and a little more, like I said, restrained than if I were just writing for some kind of brash left-wing organ.
Yeah, and good conversation is also an end in itself, and it's simply, it's intellectually stimulating. It's good for sort of the public spirit. It's good for civility. So I think we should see more of that. I think we should see more publications that are open-minded and that aren't, sort of simply going with tokenism and simply having, someone from supposedly the opposite side to, simply recite an opposite set of talking points to the ones that are being promulgated by the regular contributors to a publication. No, I think there needs to be a real discussion where people are, engaged in their political conversations, philosophical conversations, as individuals and as people who are not simply there to be cookie-cutter representatives of Republicans or Democrats or the left or the right, but who are actually sort of, human beings thinking for themselves and engaged in a real discourse.
Yeah, I was tickled to learn when I was just starting out in journalism as a fact checker at The Nation magazine. They sort of give this introductory sort of seminar in the first week or so, and one of the fun facts that we were treated to was that Pat Buchanan had written for The Nation magazine in the 1960s. So I don't know, maybe that seeded some kind of idea in me that I should attempt to transgress some of these putative ideological boundaries.
Well, I think you've done a fantastic job of that, Michael. I mean, you're really a journalist who's respected both on the left and on the right by people who value someone who actually goes out, talks to middle Americans, gets a sense of politics, sort of independent of what propaganda is emanating from either the left or the right in Washington, D.C. So kudos to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I've definitely received a lot more ire from the left over the past couple months, which is an interesting position for me to be in, because normally it's been from the right. I mean, I think you can recall during the 2012 election where I was covering campaign-related events for the American Conservative. I was very harsh on Romney. I was harsh on sort of the sentiment that had was evident among his supporters, so the backlash in that time period was more so from the right. But I don't think my bedrock positions or disposition has changed very much since then. It's just sort of we've entered a much different political context over just 4 years. So now, for whatever reason, the anger tends to come from the left.
Well, and that's a sign of integrity too. If you piss off people from either side at one time or another, that means that you're probably doing something right.
Yeah, I think that's true broadly, but at the same time, there's this cliched idea that if you equally anger both sides, that somehow means that you're in the middle and you're correct. I think doing that for its own sake is sort of just shallow contrarianism almost. Whereas I think when it's fruitful is if you're operating from a set of fundamental principles, and you don't modify those to mollify whatever kind of whatever set of people are most irritated by it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, one of the problems with our politics and with the way our media talks about our politics is that it's presented as a kind of professional wrestling, right? You've got the face and the heel. You've got these sides which are meant to be, very sharply defined. And the idea that there would be anything else in the ring that didn't match up to one side or the other is generally excluded. So you saw this, for example, with the Iraq War, where there were a number of conservatives who were very critical of what the Bush administration was doing. But when they were invited on television, whether it's on CNN or MSNBC, they were usually kind of told explicitly or otherwise that they should basically communicate the George W. Bush line, because they were being invited on as the Republican representative. And similarly, the Democrat was expected to be the Democrat. Although, funnily enough, Democrats were oftentimes more expected as well to be supportive of the Iraq War than they actually were, right? So there's this sense that even there, Democrats weren't really expected to be in opposition. They were expected to be more like Hillary Clinton and John Kerry and kind of going with the flow with some critiques of George W. Bush, but ultimately support for what he was doing. So you really have this staged theater when it comes to the conflicts in the media and in our politics. And I think we need to get away from that. I think that's one of the glorious things about Donald Trump is that, it's very hard in the abstract to say whether he was coming from the left or the right. He was someone who clearly made a lot of movement conservatives very uncomfortable. But he spoke to what middle American anxieties actually are. And as a result, he's not only become president-elect, but he's really changed the political conversation in the country.
Yeah, something that I've dwelled on a lot is, so if you follow sort of the normal political discourse, whether on Twitter, on television, on any of the normal avenues that we receive this kind of information, you don't have to look far to find just ringing condemnations of Trump from every direction constantly. So as somebody as a journalist and a writer and an analyst, I've wanted to find a different niche to approach the situation before us. So something that I focused on quite a bit was what I perceived to be contradictory critiques of Trump, or rather critiques leveled at Trump that are internally incoherent. And that came from both the left and the right. So during the Republican primary, you saw some of this, but it really came to a head during the general election when you have these competing liberal depictions of Trump. So on the one hand, he's supposedly a fascist, and on the other, he's a run-of-the-mill establishment Republican who's going to betray his supporters and give in to Paul Ryan. And the people who espouse those two portrayals of Trump simultaneously don't seem to perceive any disjunction between the two. So that's always struck me as odd, because if you want to effectively oppose Trump, and certainly his most excessive, maybe authoritarian impulses should be checked, you're not going to be able to do that, or you're going to be hobbled in your efforts if you are mired in this fundamentally self-contradictory vision of Trump.
Yeah, that's right. You would think that for their own sake, progressives would want to have a sharper and better understanding of Trump and his supporters and where they're coming from. The other thing, too, is that, of course, I think Trump really did win in Middle America. He won Michigan, he won Wisconsin, he won Pennsylvania, he won Ohio. These Rust Belt states are genuine battlegrounds, and progressives looking to the future are going to have to figure out how to win these states again in a general election, and that's going to require understanding where the kinds of voters who went for Trump are coming from. And it's very ironic because, of course, we saw various counties where Barack Obama had done very well in 2008 and 2012. Where, in fact, Donald Trump did very well in 2016. There is a genuine battleground in America, and I think writing off as deplorables, or if you're Mitt Romney, writing off as the sort of 47%, just throwing out that many voters one way or the other is completely destructive, self-destructive. So I think it behooves both progressives and conservatives to look more seriously at the middle of the country and what appeals to them.
Yeah, there was a county in Iowa that was just identified by Dave Wasserman, who is sort of an election analyst associated with the Cook Political Report at 538. And he tweeted out an example of a county that in 2012 voted for Obama by 20 points, that this year voted for Trump by 20. I said 20 points. In 2012, it was 20 points that they went for Obama. In 2016, they voted for Trump by 20 points. That's an over 40-point swing in over 4 years, which is remarkable. So to not have a curiosity as to how that could have happened is really odd. Something I've been thinking about, and I want to actually run by you, is my initial reaction to the election after the results first came in was that most of this had to do with Hillary failing to reignite the Obama coalition and fallaciously assuming that the coalition that Obama had assembled in 2008, and to a lesser degree 2012, would just sort of neatly transfer over to her, and she would be, ride to victory on the back of that. So I think on the left, there's been this tendency to want to depict the election as more to do with Hillary's being a failure on Hillary's part, rather than a triumph on Trump's part. And I think there's truth to both sides of things. It's probably somewhere in the middle. But as votes keep coming in, so the United States is supposedly the world's greatest democracy, but we can't count all our votes in over a month for some reason. So they're still coming in and still being tabulated. And as of today, Hillary is only something like 300,000 votes behind Obama 2012. Well, that's a significant chunk of votes, but it's not like several million, which is what it appeared to be in the direct aftermath of the election. So I've had to reevaluate some of my assumptions about what actually caused the outcome. And I think as the gap between Clinton 2016 and Obama 2012 narrows, it gives more credence to the theory that Trump actually won the election, in that he converted and persuaded people in some geographically critical areas to support the Republican nominee. Is that the way you look at it?
It really is. And in fact, the election worked out pretty much exactly as Trump might have hoped, and was kind of signaling that it would. That Trump's appeal to Rust Belt voters turned out to be much stronger than the appeal that people like Mitt Romney, for example, or John McCain had ever had. And there were some people who came over who had been voting for Obama, who now voted for Trump. There were many more people who came out and voted for Trump who had simply sat out the last couple of elections. So basically the class message that Trump had wound up appealing to the Rust Belt, and that made him president-elect. It goes to show that we've had these coastal elites in the Republican Party as well as in the Democratic Party who've just written off the middle of the country. And they simply think that it doesn't matter what people in Rust Belt, Pennsylvania might think, or in Wisconsin. And it turns out this was a revolt from the middle, and this was a chance for these states that had been neglected by both Republicans and Democrats when it comes to trade issues, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to culture, all across the board, and who had seen these sort of our foreign policy, which clearly wasn't doing anything for Michigan or Wisconsin or Ohio. This was a revolt. This was a chance for the people to say, we're not going to take another Clinton, just as they weren't going to take another Bush in the Republican primaries.
Yeah, and something that I've noted for a long time, and which really came to a head this election cycle, especially as the results have been evident, is that rural voters in particular are just drastically underrepresented in mainstream media. They're underrepresented in these elite different kind of entities that govern how politics works. So their views were not adequately surmised by people who think that they have the calculus for how to win elections. And it brings me back to the incredibly now ironic post-2012 Republican autopsy, which basically, if you had read that report and done the exact opposite, as Trump apparently did, that was the correct way to go about it. I mean, so they were just diametrically wrong, but with every assumption in that report, which, if nothing else, should just prove conclusively now that they're just fundamentally inept at diagnosing what it is that's going on in their own country.
Yeah, there's this powerful psychological conformity in places like Washington, D.C., and basically in the elite media, in the elite think tanks and institutions, within the top circles of both political parties. It's a divorce from reality. You may recall back around 2008, I think, there was this phrase called epistemic closure, which was popularized. Julian Sanchez, I believe, coined it. And it was this idea that Republicans were kind of living in a bubble, and the conservative movement was just talking to itself in circles and couldn't really understand how the country was operating. Well, epistemic closure, as we've now seen, really applies beyond the sort of Republican Beltway elites. It also applies just as profoundly to the Clintons and to many people on the opposite side. I think there's a very powerful and important up-down dimension to American politics, as well as a left-right dimension. And I've been saying for many years that up-down element has to be taken into account. And, populism by itself, you never have a government by sort of rural farmers and by people who just, kind of automatically spring up, the whole kind of myth and legend of Cincinnatus and so forth. You're always going to have some degree of elitism in government and any kind of powerful institution. But that doesn't mean that it has to be an elitism which is completely sort of pure-blind, and that it ignores the fact that there is a larger populace out there, and that it does have its own needs and psychological predispositions that are different from those of the elite. So I think you need to have a more open elite, and you need to have more circulation. You need to have people who can rise and fall, and not simply have this kind of closed circular conversation among the insiders.
Yeah, I remember reading the Epistemic Closure thesis when it first came out back when I was still in college. If I'm remembering correctly, I think part of what prompted it was that David Frum was one of his occasional conservative dissenter crusades, and he had put together a long article on how Rush Limbaugh and various conservative infotainment figures were distorting the incentives within the Republican Party, and it was going to lead them to perpetual doom and disaster. And I think there was some narrow validity to that, in that the constraints imposed on the Republican coalition by these various entertainment people does have some sort of can have a perverse effect. But ironically, Trump transcended the epistemic closure because he didn't abide by conventional Republican orthodoxies.
Yeah, that's right. I think epistemic closure was what you got when you combined a very rigid elite ideology with a popular medium of communication, talk radio or Fox News. And that didn't go anywhere because that profound mismatch of the message and the substance of the policies with the medium that was projecting the message simply led to a complete breakdown. I mean, the voters were not fooled. They were not fooled by Mitt Romney. Voters in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, they could see Romney, they could see Ryan, and they said, these are not guys like us. These are not guys who represent our interests. They're not passionate about, protecting American jobs. So what Trump did, as you said, he transcended epistemic closure because he basically, got the message and the means of the messaging, the talk radio and so forth, and put them together and made them, sort of reinforce one another. So now it was not only do we have a populist sort of broadcast approach, this anti-establishment, radio systems and so forth, but we also have a message which says, no, we really are going to do things differently when it comes to trade, when it comes to immigration and competition for jobs, and so forth. And voters said, you know what, this kind of sounds more plausible. And in fact, that you had all these elite media, both on the right and on the left, that you had National Review doing its, against Trump cover story back in the winter, as well as having all the establishment media, the Huffington Post and so forth, relegating Trump to the, entertainment pages and dismissing him. I think voters in Middle America looked at the reaction that the establishment elite had, both on the left and on the right, toward Trump, and they said the fact that, Trump is hated by the establishment on both sides really means that he probably is a pretty good guy, or at least a guy that we need to give a chance to. And, in terms of seeing that actually play out, it still came as a surprise. I don't know that anyone expected things to work quite as smoothly as Trump had predicted they might, but they really did. That in fact, the very voters and the very issues that he was targeting turned out to be the successful ones.
Yeah, in that infamous Never Trump National Review edition, what I found most funny was that they were bemoaning the anti-intellectual direction that Trump was taking the party and how it would discredit genuine conservatives for the foreseeable future. And one of the people that they selected to make this case and whose name they put on the cover of the magazine was Glenn Beck.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, there's just no self-awareness, no shame. They will take someone who's, a populist at best, and a kind of just ranter at worst. And they'll say, well, as long as he's mouthing the message that we're comfortable with, then we're happy to have this person. But if someone ever dares say anything about, looking out for American industry, for example, that is a sin against the Holy Spirit, and that will get you instantly excommunicated.
Mm-hmm. So I wrote a piece for the American Conservative in September, just kind of short and speculative, which basically held that a lot of Republican elites were secretly rooting for a Hillary victory, and some overtly and explicitly, but I think it was more under the radar mostly, because with a Hillary victory, they would the people whose professional lives depend on the perpetuation of the conservative movement, so to say, as it's currently constituted, they would be able to revert to form and to just become the opposition to the Clintons, who they and their constituents and their colleagues and so forth have loathed for decades, and that would serve as sort of a balm and allow them to paper over the divisions that have been made evident over the course of the Republican primary. So just for their own self-preservation, I observed that a lot of these people were hoping for a Hillary triumph, and they didn't get what they wanted. So, I mean, do you think that thesis still holds true in the sense that the Republican coalition and the current conservative movement is now going to have to seriously reorient itself? I know this involves some prediction, and it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen. But what is your current thinking on that prospect?
The thing I found most remarkable is that these supposedly oh-so-principled Never Trump people have turned on a dime and now they are desperate to have the approval of Donald Trump. Many of them are, applying for jobs in his administration. Many of their institutions and publications are basically taking a new tune. So that has actually surprised me, the degree of shamelessness. And I thought a few of these people actually had, some of their principles, and if they fairly took a position and then lost on it, I thought they would, stick with it. And my own, experience was just the opposite. I was supporting Trump at a time when it didn't look like, he was going to beat Hillary Clinton, according to the polls. But I was doing it simply because, I believed in the issues he was talking about. And I believed that, Trump, as unusual a character as he might be, was someone who would definitely shake up our politics in a way that it needed to be shaken up. So I just find it very interesting that it's not really a case that the Never Trump people are sort of the principled opposite side of some of the principled pro-Trump people. It's actually that most of the Never Trump people are just pure opportunists and pure, they have this job holder mentality, as you've explained. So they've changed. They've gone from being, maybe they preferred at one point for Hillary Clinton to win. And in fact, that was certainly the implication of their Never Trump position. I mean, it was never going to be these silly ideas that, Evan McMullin was going to steal the Electoral College, for example. That was all nonsense. I mean, clearly, if you were Never Trump, you were prepared to accept Hillary Clinton as president, and you were really, working as hard as you possibly could to make sure that Trump would lose, and by default, Clinton would win. But they are, again, they're shameless, and now they're trying very hard to say that they were, sort of Trump all along, or at least that, or that Trump has come along and has changed to, match their views. As far as the conservative movement and its institutions go, it was very interesting. I did have a few people reach out to me before the election, when it still seemed, according to the polling, as if Trump would lose and Clinton would win. And, a few folks at think tanks did reach out to me and say, even if Trump loses, we want to make sure this conversation continues, because we think he's got onto something that is really important, and that, we understand that the movement conservatism and the Republican Party have been losing touch with middle America. So there has been, some degree of reform and change within the right, even aside from Donald Trump's victory. Now, where that's going to go in the future, I really can't predict, but I'm actually kind of optimistic. I think that, after so many years of failed neoconservative policies and rhetoric that just alienated ordinary voters, I think the right now understands that there's a new path to victory, and that path is something resembling what Donald Trump has done.
Yeah, and I've tried to impart on the left that people should be cognizant that the ascendance of Trump actually opens up new space for different kinds of political arrangements and coalitions. So whatever you think of Trump as an individual, and you're still more than entitled to oppose him, but at least recognize that under Trump there is going to be an opportunity to forge different kinds of relationships and partnerships, and the sort of binary two-party structure that we had all been so accustomed to was sort of not quite as applicable now. So you don't, by no means, I would say to these people on the left, do you have to celebrate Trump or support Trump or anything like that? But at least take stock of what his intrusion into the Ori political binary does in terms of your own personal opportunities. So, the Clintonism has been basically thoroughly discredited at this point, permanently, and that was the dominant ideological strain in the Democratic Party for decades. So, what will come in its place now is still up in the air. But had Clinton won, I don't think that would have been that opportunity to forge something new would have been available. I don't see a lot of acknowledgement of that on the left. And again, it doesn't necessitate endorsing Trump or supporting Trump, which is always the fallacy that's bandied about. And I'm wondering if there's anything analogous on the right, or to the extent that you observe the left discussion, does that ring true to you?
It absolutely does. There's a chance for the left to be a real left now, that basically whatever Clinton was, as far as conservatives are concerned, Clinton was some kind of left-wing, kind of radical and so forth. But I think people on the actual left, people at The Nation, and well, The Nation, unfortunately, is a little bit of a mixed bag. But if you look at other left-wingers, I think there was always this sense that basically Hillary Clinton is a corporatist, she's a militarist, she stands for a number of things that the left really historically doesn't see itself as standing for. And so it was what exactly would the left have won, right, if Hillary Clinton had succeeded in getting elected? She would, sell out the left on economics, on foreign policy. She would pursue a bunch of, cultural issues which might be considered left-wing. But actually, a lot of those cultural issues are kind of libertarian as well. They're all about sort of individual self-expression and sort of boutique identities and so forth, as opposed to any kind of sort of old-fashioned left-wing class struggle. Well, now that the whole Clinton edifice is demolished, there's a chance for some real it's a process of creative destruction, right? I mean, you've demolished this old, ineffective kind of quasi-leftism, and now you have a chance for new competing forms of left to start springing up and, seeing what works and what actually catches the interest of the American public. And on the right, I think people were, certainly during the George W. Bush era, especially during the Iraq War, there were a lot of people who thought, Dan, you're really too harsh on Bush. And yeah, Bush might be wrong about X, Y, or Z, but, he's the best we've got right now, and that's all we're going to get, so we should really all rally behind him. And similarly with McCain and Romney. And my position was always, no, we need to absolutely get rid of these horrible Republicans who are not really, conservative in the sort of prudential sense, and who are not really right-wing in the cultural sense. We need to get rid of these people in order that we can have an actual conservative or right-wing kind of leader. And that strategy has actually worked out. And I think the right is very happy right now that it didn't settle for a Romney and didn't settle for a McCain, and that it has someone as sort of viscerally sort of pro-American as Donald Trump is.
There's a bit of a paradox there, though, right? Because Donald Trump is not personally a cultural conservative. I mean, he sounds some notes that he feels cultural conservatives want to hear. And there needs to be a distinction drawn actually between a cultural conservative and a religious conservative or a Christian conservative. And even within those categories, there are a lot of distinctions. So I think... I think the reason Trump won is because he motivated a lot of irreligious conservatives, or maybe religious conservatives who are fundamentally identified with Christianity on a cultural basis, rather than people who are pious in the way that who might have, say, supported somebody like Romney, who was seen as a little more morally upstanding and certainly not as brash on a personal level.
Except that the polling doesn't seem to back that up. So I was reading a story just today saying that Trump won 81% of evangelicals, and that Trump's support among evangelicals was actually greater than George W. Bush's in 2004. And I was talking to a friend of mine on the sort of religious right about that earlier today. And my thesis was that it's because even though Trump might deviate from social conservative issues on various points, on the things where he does seem to be committed, people trust him. They think he actually is, he has a fighting spirit, and that he's actually going to stand firm. Whereas other people like Mitt Romney, for example, Mitt Romney might check all the boxes on gay marriage or on abortion or whatever, but he always seemed like someone who had other priorities, that his priorities might have been, baiting Russia in foreign policy, or, having some sort of, big tax cuts, that those things are much more important to Romney than the social issues. With Trump, I mean, sure, it's clear that, religious liberty, for example, might not be as high on his agenda as some other things. But I think that Christian conservatives, evangelicals, are reassured that Trump actually, he's not... he's willing to confront the left. He's willing to take a lot of slings and arrows that someone like Romney or John McCain might not have been willing to do. I think Trump is willing to confront things and cause trouble and fight battles in a way that I don't think anyone really had confidence that Romney or McCain or the Bush types would.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, so maybe Trump won a greater percentage of evangelicals compared to Bush 04. But I'd be curious to see if evangelical turnout overall increased or decreased compared to 2004.
Well, it might have.
I'd be surprised if it were the case, but I don't know.
I think it may well have increased. And you have to remember, too, that throughout the Obama years, whether it was the Little Sisters of the Poor and the ways in which Obamacare was affecting them, whether it was, some of the transsexual bathroom legislation that came at the end, no single one of these things was enough to galvanize a huge number of voters. But I think in the aggregate, they created an impression among evangelical voters and among religious voters in general that perhaps they were kind of steadily losing ground and just being under siege, on one issue after another. And so I think they saw that would continue under Hillary Clinton. Whereas with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is not someone who's going to suddenly, roll back something like gay marriage, for example, but Donald Trump is someone who's clearly not going to keep, chopping away at the religious liberties that evangelicals are most concerned about. So I think they did a logical thing. I think they saw that it was either maintain a course that they disagreed with strongly under Obama with Hillary Clinton, or simply arrest that course with Donald Trump.
I think one of the reasons why Trump had a transcendent appeal is because he could allay the fears and concerns of those more conventional evangelical voters or religious evangelicals, conservatives. But at the same time, he had appeal among, like I said before, irreligious conservatives or conservatives who were religious more in a cultural sense than a direct, in terms of direct personal piety. So I don't think you would. That's why I think he was able to galvanize such incredible turnout in places like Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, where you don't really have a huge evangelical population by any stretch, in places like rural northern Maine, where there's almost no evangelicals. But there are people who have sort of just a conservative cultural disposition, who might have not been totally enamored of somebody like Ted Cruz or even George W. Bush, who were more overt about their religiosity. But in Trump, somebody who was a little more akin to how they conceptualize conservatism.
Yeah, and I would actually bring these 2 points together, because it seems to me that what Trump did is to change the way religion and politics relate to one another on the right. That there had been this tendency with people like George W. Bush and with people like Ted Cruz to emphasize, these sort of personal proclamations of piety that just didn't wash with voters. Voters looked at that and they said, we don't necessarily care so much about that. We don't care about, whether you're going to name the correct, book of the Bible, or that you're going to say Jesus is your favorite philosopher. What we care about is actually, what do the policies look like when you take office? And when it comes to policies, it's not just, it's not as if there's a, kind of, even evangelical voters are not single issue or, sort of single set of issue voters. They're people who also have concerns about jobs. They have concerns about, whether their children are being sent abroad to, kill and die for, so-called moderate Islamists or something. I think, both among religious voters and among less religious voters, they looked at the new kind of relationship between politics and religion that Trump promises, which is a more practical relationship and a less sort of a less symbolically overblown relationship. And they said, what, we prefer this. We want to see actual results. We don't want to see just professions. And I think, if you look at how Christian conservative leaders and writers approach this, you saw some very interesting distinctions. And that, there are a lot of writers and Christian conservative leaders who really mix up the categories of religion and politics in a profound way, not in the sense that they're trying to become theocrats, but in the sense that they really don't understand the difference between being personally pious and being a competent or effective politician and governor. And that was certainly a problem with George W. Bush and those who were supporting him. They looked and they said, well, he's a personally pious guy, and therefore, his policies must not be disastrous. But in fact, they were disastrous, especially in foreign policy. And I think with Trump, you see the opposite. And actually, voters were very wise to perceive the opposite there. They were willing to say, look, personally, who knows where his commitments may lie, but this is someone whose program we think is a bit more sensible than the other ones we've heard about. And of course, there's a parallel for this, right? I mean, this was very much the case with Ronald Reagan. His own religiosity was, kind of hard to describe, hard to define. He was not someone who had an orthodox religious disposition.
He was divorced.
He was, the first divorced president. he had this kind of Emersonian side to him. He was, sort of religious in a very sort of broad and vague way, not in a kind of doctrinally precise way that might appeal to, or might be thought to appeal to evangelicals. But in fact, Reagan was someone that religious voters were very much willing to support because they thought, this is someone who is capable of wielding power in a way that that they approved of. So the personal religiosity was not what it was all about. And I think that's correct. That's how, religious voters should look at politics. They should say, what are the actual policies you're going to get? Not, is this person fit for canonization or becoming a saint or becoming, some sort of messiah figure on earth?
Yeah, he's not running for pope. That was a line you heard often from sort of semi-ambivalent Trump supporters who were questioned on how they could support somebody who was so personally vulgar and crass. I tend to think that the deprioritization of personal piety could actually have a salutary effect for religious conservatives, because if they're seen to prioritize personal piety, then that's going to invite politicians to just pander to them and to recite various kind of creedal chants and vows and professions, like you said. And it's actually going to compel politicians not to want to fulfill whatever kind of policy desires that these voters have, but rather just try to flatter them with references to the Bible and to the the divinity of Jesus and so forth. So I think that actually could be something to be embraced by evangelical voters. And I'm not speaking as an evangelical voter, so I can't tell them what to believe on that score. But from an outsider's perspective, it seems like it could be useful to them in a sense.
Oh, I think you're entirely right. I think they will, we'll see what kinds of policies they actually get from Trump, but I think they are confident in him, much as they were confident in Ronald Reagan, in a way that is very different from feeling a sort of spiritual sympathy with George W. Bush. And I think now that there are sort of test cases on both sides, right, they can compare the Reagan record to the George W. Bush record, and soon they'll be able to compare the Donald Trump record to the Bush record. I think they're going to wind up seeing that, politics is a practical matter. It's not a matter about simply having formulas in the mind or having, a perfectly nice character. That in fact, it's really about, what you do, not simply what you believe.
Right. I want to touch a little bit on foreign policy while we have some time left. So back in April, Trump gave one of his first formal addresses at the National Interest. And I guess it's the Center for National Interest, it's the title. And he outlined basically a Buchanan-like foreign policy philosophy, which deprioritized or de-emphasized omnidirectional belligerence, which is the term that I like. It just removing various tyrants from abroad and just trying to concentrate American foreign policy on what is more precisely in the national interest. And he sort of he held pretty fast to that position throughout the entirety of the campaign. I mean, even on Halloween night, so something like 7 or 8 days before the election, go look up a quote that he made an address in Michigan, and he was basically saying that Hillary's foreign policy record is a disaster. Look where it got us in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and it was sort of a bipartisan indictment as well. And I'm wondering, it can be a little bit of a fool's errand to try to read the tea leaves about appointments and about whatever sort of gestures he's made in the months since the election. But has your confidence increased or decreased since November 8th that he'll actually try to fulfill those pledges and the philosophy that he put forward back at that April national interest speech?
My confidence is about the same as it was back then. Trump has always had advisors who come from a variety of different perspectives on foreign policy. And Trump himself is much more, I think, non-interventionist, or at least, disinclined to, sort of direct military engagement in various parts of the world than some of the people, in his circles. The other difficulty is that there are only so many people who have experience at a level of government or at a level of, sort of parallel institutions, whether it's the military or business, who can be brought into an administration who have sort of purely realist views. So it used to be, you had these kind of Brent Scowcroft types and whatnot, who were staffing the George H.W. Bush administration back in the early 1990s. But at this point, they're all very old, and what should have been the next generation of those kinds of Republican realists was instead replaced by the neoconservatives during the George W. Bush administration. So given the materials he has to work with, I think Trump is actually doing the right thing and doing a smart thing. So he has military figures, people like Flynn, for example, and Mattis, who are being brought into the administration. And, I think some people are worried that they will be extremely hawkish. But they are military people, which means they have a sense of exactly what the stakes are, and the difficulties of logistically moving troops into a country, the risks involved in wars getting out of hand and not going the way you expect. So I think there's a degree of professional restraint baked into even someone who has a nickname as a mad dog, or even someone who has a reputation for being, sort of very worried about Iran, or very worried about, other threats. So I think that level of experience is better than having someone who's a political, sort of ideologue come in, who, might be able to say some nice things occasionally, but who actually simply has no idea what the real world consequences are of going to war. And it seems to me that one of the things Trump is doing both in foreign policy and also in economic policy is to take the materials he has, to take the best people he can find, whether they're coming from Wall Street or coming from the military, and to employ those people in the service of a new agenda, an agenda that's very different from that of previous Republicans. So the question is Trump going to be able to take people who had worked for Goldman Sachs and get them to serve middle American interests? And it's very easy for people to cynically say, well, of course not. He's simply selling out his voters. He's simply giving Goldman Sachs what it wants. But I'm not so sure about that. I think that actually the fact that Trump, in order to get reelected, is going to need to win Pennsylvania, he's going to need to win Ohio, that means he has to deliver on his promises. And that means he has a very powerful incentive to make sure that the people he brings into his cabinet on economic policy deliver on what he has promised. And I think similarly on foreign policy, it's the same thing, that America is not eager to get into another ground war, especially not in the Middle East. So his generals and his advisors, they're going to, however, whatever their ordinary dispositions might be, I think Trump is going to have an effect of moving them to be very realistic and very cautious. It's not going to be a sort of pacifistic Ron Paul administration, but I think it's going to be parallel to Ronald Reagan. I think you're going to see, this is kind of a Christmas come early for the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, perhaps. But I don't think we're going to see moves to insert troops into the Middle East and otherwise have a heavy footprint. I think what the middle ground that's going to wind up being occupied by Trump and his advisors will be this idea of finding forces within a particular region who can advance American interests without America having to be directly involved. And that itself is, of course, sort of fraught with risks, but it's not the kinds of investment and catastrophic mistakes that we've seen with the Iraq War in particular.
Yeah, I think one of the more legitimate worries about Trump is that, notwithstanding his own personal predilections, the roster of people that he has to draw staff from is fairly limited, because it's going to, even if he's defied Republican orthodoxies, on the whole, the people available to him to select for prominent positions are going to be, broadly speaking, the Republican orbit. So he has, Reince Priebus as his chief of staff. If a lot of the picks are being filtered through him, they're not going to be especially radical, I would think. I mean, Trump has the final say, it would seem. But if Priebus is an intermediary, I don't think he's necessarily going to be disposed to want to bring in people who have a fundamentally radical or unorthodox view of things.
Well, I think there's a meeting of minds taking place. First of all, from what I hear, the president-elect is actually being quite hands-on and has had a phenomenal number of interviews with candidates for various positions. So it's not that everything is being farmed out to the Republican apparatus. And second of all, even as far as some of the Republicans are concerned, whether it's Priebus or whether it's others, I think you'd be surprised by the degree to which a lot of them, their hearts and minds have changed as a result of Trump. Not just his success, but even, having seen him make the pitch that he made over the course of the election.
And just to interject briefly, Mike Pence was quoted a week or so ago, basically declaring that free trade is a failure. That's right. That's remarkable.
Oh, it's amazing, and people may be again cynical, and they might think, well, Pence is just doing this because, of course, he has to do it to be loyal to the president. But I actually think there's an element, probably a big element, of genuine conversion here, not only with Pence, but also with people like Newt Gingrich. In many cases, these Republicans had simply never heard anyone make a case that there was anything other than just macroeconomics 101 to determine what trade policy should be. And many of them, now that they've heard for the first time and seen, in a politically active way, what economic policy and trade policy can mean to Middle America, it's not just a cynical change. I think it really is. They've discovered that the world doesn't work in quite the way they thought it did 20 years ago. I've seen various indications at many levels, high and low, that Republicans are becoming more open-minded, that they really do understand that the project that George W. Bush and that Romney and McCain had been invested in, both economically and also in foreign policy, this idea of a kind of new world order, as George H.W. Bush had called it, really has broken down, and that there's a need for some alternative. And Trump is the first person who's come along who has, kind of offered that alternative in the since the 1990s, since the George W. Bush era. And as a result, I think people are changing their minds. I think you're actually going to see a lot of Republicans you might have had doubts about before become rather more reliable now that Trump is in office. Or at least that's my hope.
I think that makes sense, because if you're someone like Pence, you've been immersed in Republican convention and conservative orthodoxies for most of your adult life, and where you do come across a critique of free trade, it's going to be from the left prior to Trump. So you're probably going to be likely to discount it as left-wing, pie-in-the-sky nonsense. But if somebody on your own side, so to say, is advancing that argument, if you're Pence, you're going to be more inclined to give it some degree of credence. I wouldn't be surprised if that is the case for other Republican figures, because, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of these people aren't hardened ideologues. They're in the game for professional advancement reasons, to a large extent. So if somebody comes along like Trump and actually provides evidence that divergence from these orthodoxies is electorally advantageous, then maybe that could actually cause them to shift on what they had claimed were fundamental policy prescriptions that they held fast to.
Well, and if you look at polling of Republicans, it was very interesting. I attended a briefing at the Center for the National Interest from a couple of pollsters from Gallup and one other organization, looking at what voters for not only Donald Trump in the primaries, but also Ted Cruz and John Kasich, and where they stood on free trade. And it turned out that all of those voters were more skeptical of free trade than even Bernie Sanders voters in the Democratic primaries. So what you've seen is a transformation in the way grassroots Republicans look at some of these issues, in particular trade. And so not only at the top, not only with Donald Trump having his own views, but also at the bottom with the grassroots voters themselves changing their perspective. I think that puts a double pressure on the middle, the sort of administrative apparatus of the party and of government, and all the sort of intermediary levels of power between the president and the ordinary voter. It's put a pressure on them to kind of look at the world through fresh eyes. And it doesn't mean that they're going to instantly, throw out all their old beliefs on trade or on foreign policy or on whatever else. But it means that they have to start re-examining things and start, doing a little bit more thinking originally and thinking for themselves. And that's tremendously powerful. I mean, I think it's always a mistake to underestimate the sheer degree of conformity involved in ideological movements and involved in sort of detached elites in Washington and elsewhere. That pure conformity that's just reflexive and totally unexamined dictates so much of what people do. So when someone like Trump comes along, or when a grassroots revolt comes along, and it shatters that conformity, I don't think that conformity can reassert itself very easily, because it's a habit that once broken would require effort to reestablish, and that effort is something that many people, it would require just as much effort to reestablish as it would to, take a new direction. So if you're going to make the effort either way, you might as well think it through carefully and decide for yourself, rather than just robotically going back to what you'd been doing before.
Yeah, and I wonder if that would apply equally to the foreign policy area. So maybe you would think actually that the economic policy is where a lot of these people would be less inclined to budge, because that's sort of been the foundation of a lot of how they've organized themselves as a coalition. So that would be more surprising. Whereas foreign policy, it's been a little more tangential. It's been a little more. It's not the reason why they back various interventionist endeavors is I don't think mostly because they are philosophically disposed to support them, aside for a small coterie of neocons. But I'm just wondering if that same outlook will be transposed onto their foreign policy visions. I actually just watched Trump in North Carolina. He gave his Thank You America. He's on his Thank You America tour, and he introduced Mad Dog Mattis formally at this event. And Trump reiterated basically the anti-interventionist stance that he had been espousing since the beginning at this post-election event. So that would be, I think, a reasonably reassuring harbinger of maybe what's to come. He didn't go on as one of his Michael Moore style rants, which he actually did a couple of, especially when he was up against Jeb Bush. Some of my favorite moments of all time, really, in political history. So I mean, I guess that gives us some sense that maybe he is actually compelling a reevaluation within the Republican coalition of foreign policy. And actually, you see a mirror image of this on the Democratic side now, because all of a sudden, your rank and file House Democrats became huge Russia hawks overnight, because they thought it would be politically advantageous to try to tie Trump to Putin and cast that as some kind of nefarious foreign influence. So one of the reasons why I wrote that American Conservative piece postulating that maybe movement conservatives didn't want Trump to win is because the president has a trickle-down effect on how the coalitions of both parties are assembled, and the composition of those coalitions. So inevitably, it's going to have an impact in the positions he takes and espouses. It's going to have an impact on both sides. So, I mean, hopefully that's it's in a beneficial direction there, as much as possible.
That's right. I think this is it's a creative moment in politics, and I think neither the left nor the right is going to emerge from the next several months looking all that much like what it had been, 6 months ago or 12 months ago. And the changes are not going to be, sort of night and day, instantly predictable kinds of things. It's not as if, the Robert Taft foreign policy or, the Ron Paul foreign policy is going to suddenly emerge in the Trump administration. It's going to be give and take. It's going to be its own thing. There's going to be evolution. There's going to be development in directions that no one can predict. But I do think that we have seen the comprehensive defeat of the sort of Bushian approach to things. And that in itself that's the first step. I mean, that was necessary. And similarly on the left, I think you've seen the complete defeat of the Clinton approach to intervention in the world. And that clears the way to have a discussion on the left, maybe a battle on the left, as to what the future of foreign policy for the Democrats and for progressives is going to be. And these debates, I mean, no matter how they resolve themselves, I'm at least happy to see that these questions are being raised now, and that there's a real honest discussion and a bit of back and forth. Because, for so long, I remember going back to the Iraq War, there was just this, again, massive conformity and this instant deference, and this idea that no other policy beyond war was thinkable when it came to Iraq, or when it came to any number of other crises, or that we were constantly going to ratchet up the tension with Russia, and that maybe we'd have a no-fly zone in Syria, and if we wound up shooting down Russian jets, well, gosh, we can just accept the consequences, or that'll somehow get Putin to back down. The degree of brinksmanship and recklessness that characterized Hillary Clinton, and that would have characterized some of the Republicans who had received the nominee in the past 8 year nomination in the past 8 years, just would have been astonishing and extremely dangerous. So, admittedly, we can't predict what the future is going to bring in the next few months or the next few years, but we know it's not, I think, going to be a reversion to what we've seen in the past. And so that by itself is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it really does feel like a dawn of a new era. I mean, we've sort of been in the shadow of Bush for a while, and even Obama was a reaction to that. But it seems like Trump really does represent a sharp break from the political environment that we've been so accustomed to for so long now.
I would go even further. I'd say it's been a break with everything that we've seen since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And that, in the same way that the end of the Cold War marked a new era, a new epoch in American politics, in foreign policy and trade policy, and in terms of how Republicans and Democrats left and right define themselves, I think Trump has it's almost a Berlin Wall moment for our own politics. It's set up a series of redefinitions and rethinkings, reconceptualizations, both on the left and on the right. So again, we don't know exactly where things are going to go, but I'm happy to see that I think both American voters, and I think also, thinkers, anyone who's politically engaged and is not simply a zombie marching to the orders of some ideologue, everyone now has a chance to kind of re-engage and to make a difference for the country.
Yeah, and just as a concluding note, I actually think it's advantageous for Trump to have lost the popular vote, although that's not binding on him in terms of the Electoral College, obviously. It will, I think, diminish somewhat his perceived mandate. So he'll have to act as though the Democrats are sort of breathing down his neck, and maybe that'll restrain him from going down the path of Republican orthodoxy, which is a possibility in certain regards.
Yeah, I agree. I think the political realities, not just the popular vote, but also the fact that the critical states that delivered the presidency to Donald Trump were the Rust Belt states. Both of those factors mean that Trump is going to want to deliver on the promises he's made. He's going to want to, create real change in American economic and foreign policies, and basically do a better job than either Republicans or Democrats have done in the last generation of serving the American people as a whole. So it's a big challenge. But I think that's what Trump is going to have to live up to if he wants to win re-election.
Yeah, and by the way, he came within about a point of winning Minnesota, which hadn't voted for Republicans in over 100 years. Something pretty astonishing. So I think Trump has his eye on that as a prize for 2020 as well. I mean, if a few things tipped a little differently, he could have won there, in addition to the other Rust Belt states. This was an interesting discussion. I hope viewers found it fruitful and edifying. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. Take care.